When the first groups of captured German soldiers arrived in the United States in 1943, they carried with them the weight of propaganda and fear. They had been told that Americans were ruthless, that prisoners would be starved, beaten, or sent to labor until they collapsed. The train doors opened not to barbed wire wastelands or mud pits, but to orderly camps lined with whitewashed barracks, mess halls, and baseball fields. Everything seemed wrong to them, not cruel enough, not chaotic enough for war. What they found was a system that reflected a nation's belief in law, even in the treatment of its enemies. At first, the discipline and structure of the camps were disorienting. Each man was registered, issued clean uniforms marked PW, and assigned to a work detail. Schedules were printed, duties were posted, and officers explained that they would be working for wages. Not cash, but credit, small daily payments of 80 cents recorded on camp accounts and redeemable as scrip for cigarettes, soap, or stationery. The rules of the Geneva Convention, which many had barely heard of, were enforced with bureaucratic precision. For soldiers who had seen how prisoners were treated in Europe, the difference was shocking. The camps themselves looked less like prisons and more like temporary towns. Many were built on old fairgrounds, abandoned CCC sites, or open farmland. They had libraries, classrooms, and sports fields. In Camp Algona, Iowa, prisoners could join orchestras or attend English lessons. In Camp Ruston, Louisiana, they painted murals on the walls. The structure was unmistakably military: roll calls, inspections, curfews. But behind it stood something unfamiliar to many Germans: the idea that work, even that of a captive, should retain dignity. When the first work detachments left for the fields, the shock deepened. Instead of being forced into exhausting or degrading labor, the prisoners were trucked to nearby farms, where they were given gloves, tools, and instructions. They were told that every hour of their work was accounted for, that the farmers paid the government for their labor, and that a portion of this payment went to them. It was an extraordinary arrangement. The enemy soldiers were helping harvest America's crops, and America was paying them for it. To the German mind, shaped by a regime that glorified obedience and power, this approach was almost incomprehensible. Payment was not expected, punishment was. Yet here was a nation that treated even its captives as participants in an ordered system. No one shouted threats. Instead, there were ledgers, contracts, and pay rates. This bureaucratic fairness, mundane on the surface, was what most unsettled them. It revealed a society so confident in its institutions that it extended them even to its enemies. In the long, hot months of 1944, as the prisoners worked the fields of Kansas, Minnesota, and Alabama, many realized they had entered a world built on principles they had never known firsthand. The United States had transformed war into administration, captivity into employment, and humiliation into structure. For men who had expected chains, the sight of an American foreman counting their work hours on a clipboard became a symbol of something far deeper: the triumph of rules over revenge. In that quiet order lay a message more powerful than propaganda: that a nation's strength could be measured not only by the weapons it built, but by the justice it extended to those who had fought against it. By 1944, the United States faced a silent crisis within its own borders. While the nation's factories roared with the production of tanks, ships, and ammunition, vast stretches of farmland lay at risk of ruin. The war had drained the countryside of labor. More than 16 million Americans were serving in the armed forces, and millions more had left rural communities to work in war industries along the coasts. Tractors stood idle, crops ripened without hands to harvest them, and entire states began to fear a collapse of their agricultural output. For a country that prided itself on feeding not only its own people but also its allies across 2 oceans, this shortage was more than an inconvenience. It was a threat to the war effort itself. The numbers told a stark story. In 1943, the United States produced record quantities of wheat, corn, and cotton, yet by mid-1944 it lacked the labor to bring much of it in. State agricultural boards reported losses that could reach millions of bushels. In Kansas and Nebraska, grain elevators were full of last year's harvest, but the new one risked rotting in the fields. In Alabama and Mississippi, cotton bolls withered on the stalks as temperatures climbed. Seasonal workers, once drawn from migrant families and Mexican labor programs, were no longer enough to fill the gap. The War Food Administration issued urgent memoranda warning that without immediate action, food shortages could affect not only domestic markets, but also the supply lines feeding Allied troops in Europe and the Pacific. The crisis was particularly severe in the Midwest and South, where agriculture relied on large seasonal surges of manpower. Rural towns had emptied almost overnight. Men who once plowed fields now wore uniforms. Their sons enlisted, their daughters left for factories in Detroit or aircraft plants in California. The machinery of the farm could not run without people, and no amount of patriotic posters could summon enough hands to lift the burden. Farmers, already strained by wartime rationing of fuel and equipment, now faced the possibility of losing entire crops. In this atmosphere of growing alarm, an unexpected resource emerged behind the fences of America's newly built prison camps. By the summer of 1944, there were more than 400,000 prisoners of war held on American soil, captured soldiers from North Africa, Italy, and, increasingly, Germany. They were scattered across hundreds of camps, from Texas to Minnesota, and guarded under the strict provisions of the 1929 Geneva Convention. The War Department, confronted with both the labor crisis and the responsibility of maintaining so many captives, began to see a solution in their coexistence. Economically and legally, it made sense. The Geneva Convention allowed prisoners to be employed in non-military labor as long as it did not endanger their health or dignity, and as long as they were compensated. The United States, unlike many nations at war, was in a unique position to implement this system on a massive scale. The country had the land, the infrastructure, and a belief, deeply ingrained in its institutions, that even war must operate within the bounds of law. The idea that prisoners could help save the nation's harvest was not framed as exploitation but as mutual necessity. Still, the plan faced resistance. Many Americans were uneasy about bringing enemy soldiers into their communities. Newspaper editorials questioned the wisdom of letting Nazis roam the countryside, even under guard. Families who had sons fighting in Europe found it difficult to accept that the same enemy might now work their neighbors' fields. Yet the arithmetic of survival was persuasive. The War Manpower Commission calculated that each prisoner employed in agriculture could replace one absent American worker, freeing citizens for other essential wartime duties. The government reassured the public that strict oversight would prevent abuse or escape, and that the system was not charity, it was efficiency. As the summer of 1944 unfolded, the problem of labor scarcity evolved into an administrative challenge rather than a moral one. The office of the Provost Marshal General created regional commands to coordinate the movement of work detachments. Camps were established near rail lines and farming centers to minimize travel time. Farmers submitted requests for workers through county agents, and payments were processed through government channels. What had begun as an emergency response soon grew into a nationwide program, balancing necessity with legality. Behind the policy, however, lay a deeper tension. The United States had to reconcile its self-image as a defender of freedom with the reality of using enemy labor to sustain its own war machine. It was a paradox that would define much of the home front during these years, the country fighting tyranny abroad while maintaining strict fairness at home, even toward those who had served that tyranny. The problem was no longer simply a shortage of hands, it was the test of a principle. In the face of total war, America had to decide whether law and humanity could survive alongside victory. The framework that allowed the United States to employ prisoners of war during World War II had been laid years earlier, in the aftermath of another global conflict. The Geneva Convention of 1929, drafted in response to the brutal treatment of captives during World War I, established clear rules for how nations were to handle prisoners. It stated that all prisoners had to be treated humanely, protected from violence and humiliation, and granted certain rights, including the right to be paid for their labor. Forced or dangerous labor was explicitly forbidden, and any work performed had to contribute to the maintenance of the prisoners themselves or the civilian economy, never directly to the enemy's military operations. When the United States entered World War II in 1941, It formally adopted these principles into military law. The War Department issued detailed regulations under the authority of the Provost Marshal General, the office responsible for all prisoners of war. These rules were remarkable in their precision. They outlined the size of barracks, the number of calories per meal, the required medical facilities, and the procedures for paying wages. By the time German troops began to surrender in North Africa in 1943, the legal and administrative machinery was already in place to handle them. The rapid influx of captives after the North African campaign created a logistical challenge unprecedented in American history. Tens of thousands of German and Italian soldiers were transported by ship across the Atlantic to prevent escape or rescue. They arrived in ports such as Norfolk, Boston, and New Orleans before being sent inland by train to newly constructed camps. These facilities were scattered across the continental United States, large base camps that could hold several thousand men, surrounded by hundreds of smaller branch camps established near farms, sawmills, and canning factories. From the beginning, the United States emphasized order and legality. Each camp operated under military discipline but within a framework designed to mirror the standards set by the Geneva Convention. The prisoners were required to salute American officers, but they could also elect representatives among themselves to communicate with camp authorities, a provision meant to preserve morale and ensure fairness. Red Cross inspectors regularly visited the camps to verify compliance with international law. Their reports, preserved in archives, show that conditions were generally far better than those in Axis-run facilities in Europe or Asia. The economic dimension of this system soon became vital. The War Department recognized that employing prisoners could both sustain the national economy and maintain discipline within the camps. Idle men were more likely to cause unrest. Meaningful work provided structure and purpose. However, strict conditions applied. Prisoners could not be used in any task connected to weapons production or military installations, nor could they be assigned to work that was considered unhealthy or degrading. Most were directed to agriculture, forestry, or public works projects. To implement this efficiently, the United States divided the country into regional prisoner of war service commands. Each command coordinated with local governments and private employers. Contracts were signed between the War Department and local agencies, county agricultural boards, food processing plants, and timber companies. The employer paid the government directly for each prisoner's labor, usually at the prevailing local wage for comparable civilian work. From this payment, the government deducted costs for housing, food, and supervision. The prisoners themselves received a nominal daily wage of 80 cents, credited to their accounts in camp canteens, where they could purchase personal goods. The use of scrip, or camp-issued currency, was a deliberate choice. It prevented escape by ensuring that prisoners' earnings had no value outside the camp while still honoring the spirit of the Geneva Convention. This system also allowed the military to track each man's work record, hours, and conduct. For many prisoners, this routine of wages and accounting symbolized a strange return to normalcy amid captivity. Historically, this approach reflected broader American values of procedural fairness and institutional control. The United States, far from the devastation of the European battlefields, had both the resources and the confidence to manage its captives through administration rather than brutality. The system became, in a sense, an experiment in wartime ethics. Could a democracy fight total war without abandoning its own laws? The treatment of prisoners became a quiet but powerful answer to that question. By late 1944, this organized framework had turned into one of the largest managed labor programs in American history. It spanned more than 40 states, employed hundreds of thousands of men, and supplied crucial labor to farms, factories, and forests. Each contract, ledger, and pay stub reflected not only the efficiency of wartime bureaucracy but also the underlying belief that even in conflict, rules mattered. Behind the fences of those camps, the United States demonstrated that justice could coexist with victory, and that law, rather than vengeance, could guide the machinery of war. The turning point in the prisoner of war labor program came in the summer of 1944, when the demands of American farmers collided with the rigid systems of wartime bureaucracy. By then, the prisoner camps had expanded across more than 40 states, housing over 400,000 Axis captives, most of them German soldiers captured in North Africa, Sicily, and later in France. As harvest season approached, letters and telegrams began to pour into the offices of the War Food Administration and the Provost Marshal General. County agents and state agricultural boards warned that crops would rot in the fields unless the prisoners were put to work on a larger scale. It was not ideology that forced the change, but necessity. The War Department faced a delicate balance. On one hand, it had to comply with the Geneva Convention, which forbade exploitation or exposure of prisoners to danger. On the other, it had to respond to mounting political pressure from farmers and state officials who saw acres of unharvested grain as both an economic loss and a moral failure during wartime. The government realized that the only way to expand the use of prisoner labor without chaos was to establish a clear, standardized system of contracts, payment, and supervision. In August 1944, the Provost Marshal General's office issued uniform guidelines that would govern every work detail. These rules set the hourly rate farmers would pay to the government, between 40 and 55 cents per prisoner per hour, depending on the state and type of labor. This rate matched what local civilian workers would have earned, ensuring that the program would not undercut domestic wages. The money went directly to the U.S. Treasury, not to the prisoners themselves. From this sum, the military deducted the costs of transportation, guards, food, and lodging, while each prisoner was credited with a fixed allowance of 80 cents per day in camp currency. This administrative precision transformed what had begun as a series of improvised local arrangements into a national labor program. Requests for prisoner work teams were now handled through county agricultural offices. Farmers filed applications listing the number of workers needed, the expected duration of employment, and the type of work. Military trucks would then transport small squads, typically 10 to 20 men, to the designated farms each morning under the watch of 1 or 2 guards. In some rural areas, where the prisoners' behavior had already proven trustworthy, guards were later reduced or even eliminated altogether. For many German soldiers, the revelation that their work was being tracked and compensated according to American wage law was deeply disorienting. They had been raised on propaganda portraying the United States as a ruthless capitalist empire that enslaved workers and despised the defeated. Yet here, in a country at war with their own, they were treated as paid laborers, subject to rules, schedules, and even wage slips. It was not generosity but adherence to a principle, the American belief that order and fairness were necessary even in wartime. Accounts preserved in post-war memoirs and Red Cross reports revealed the depth of this shock. Prisoners described their astonishment at being given time sheets, issued meal rations identical to those of American soldiers, and allowed to purchase cigarettes or soap with the scrip they earned. For men who had fought in the deserts of North Africa or on the steppes of Russia, the idea that work could be met with payment instead of punishment challenged everything they had been taught about their enemies. It was a bureaucratic miracle of sorts, a war run by ledgers instead of lashes. The catalyst also revealed something about American pragmatism. Officials in Washington did not view the arrangement as an act of mercy but as a practical solution to a labor crisis. Every working prisoner meant one less wasted acre of wheat, one more shipment of canned food for the troops overseas. The structure of payment and accountability ensured that the system remained efficient and morally defensible. By tying the program to established wage standards and Geneva Convention requirements, the government could present it as both lawful and patriotic. For the farmers themselves, the system brought a sense of relief. They no longer had to plead for volunteers or watch their crops decay. In states like Kansas, Iowa, and Alabama, prisoner labor became an accepted part of the rural economy almost overnight. Men wearing khaki uniforms marked PW could be seen picking corn, hauling hay, and tending orchards from dawn to dusk. They were not slaves, nor exactly free men, but something in between, workers governed by law in a time when law itself was being tested by war. This transformation marked the moment when America's handling of prisoners became something larger than logistics. It was a demonstration of national character expressed through paperwork and pay scales. The meticulous records of hours worked, wages paid, and scrip issued stood as quiet evidence of a society determined to keep its moral compass intact amid the world's chaos. What began as an emergency measure became, in effect, a statement of identity, a belief that justice, measured in cents per hour, could still define a nation even as it fought for survival. Each morning, as the sun rose over the American heartland, military trucks bearing the large black letters, PW, rolled out of the gates of prisoner-of-war camps. Inside sat groups of 10 to 20 men, dressed in khaki uniforms stenciled with the same initials, prisoner of war. Their destinations varied depending on the region: the rolling wheat fields of Kansas, the corn and pea farms of Minnesota, the cotton plantations of Alabama, or the orchards of California. The system that brought them there was one of the most extensive and efficiently managed labor networks in the history of the United States, and every element of it was governed by strict military order and civilian coordination. The workday began early. By 6 o'clock the prisoners had eaten breakfast, usually oatmeal, bread, and coffee, nearly identical to the rations of U.S. soldiers. Guards conducted a head count, and each work detachment was loaded onto trucks or buses, sometimes escorted by local sheriffs or civilian overseers deputized by the Army. The destination was rarely more than 20 miles away. The War Department required that prisoner work details remain within a defined radius to prevent long transports or opportunities for escape. When they arrived at the farms or processing plants, the guards often stood at a distance, rifles slung casually, more for formality than necessity. In the early stages of the program, supervision was strict. Soldiers accompanied the men at all times, and communication with civilians was limited. But as months passed and escape attempts proved rare, regulations relaxed. In many Midwestern states, guards were replaced with unarmed civilian supervisors, often the farmers themselves. Reports from Iowa, Minnesota, and Nebraska noted that prisoners performed their duties without incident and frequently exceeded expectations in both efficiency and discipline. Farmers learned that they could rely on them as they would any seasonal worker. The work was demanding but humane. Prisoners harvested crops, repaired fences, cleaned irrigation ditches, loaded grain sacks, and worked in canning factories or lumber mills. In some regions, they cut pulpwood for paper production or cleared debris from flood-prone lands. The average day lasted 8 to 9 hours, with an hour break for lunch. Each man's output was recorded and verified by the supervising officer, who then submitted reports to the camp's administrative office for wage calculation. When the trucks returned in the late afternoon, the process reversed itself. Roll calls were taken again at the gates. The men were searched for contraband, knives, money, or notes from civilians, and then dismissed to showers and evening meals. The day's wages, 80 cents, were credited to individual camp accounts, not given in cash but as scrip redeemable in the canteen. In these small camp stores, the prisoners could buy cigarettes, candy, soap, postcards, or small comforts imported by the Red Cross. Many spent their evenings reading German newspapers printed by the War Department, playing soccer, or writing letters home under the watchful eye of censors. Behind this seemingly simple routine lay a web of administrative precision. Each camp maintained meticulous ledgers that tracked hours worked, wages earned, and supplies issued. The office of the Provost Marshal General required monthly reports detailing not only productivity but also conduct, morale, and health conditions. Regional labor officers coordinated with state agricultural boards to forecast manpower needs and allocate work detachments accordingly. Transportation schedules, guard rosters, and payroll ledgers were handled with military punctuality. In Minnesota, thousands of prisoners were assigned to pecaneries and sugar beet fields that had once relied on migrant labor. In Kansas and Oklahoma, they filled the gap left by farmhands drafted into the Army, ensuring the wheat harvest reached record volumes despite the war. In Alabama and Mississippi, they picked cotton under the same blazing sun that had driven earlier generations of laborers, though now under laws that demanded fair treatment and compensation. Even in remote parts of Oregon and Idaho, prisoners felled trees and built roads through the forests, their labor silently supporting the logistics of a nation at war. What made the system remarkable was not only its efficiency but its orderliness. Each prisoner wore a numbered tag that corresponded to his personal record file, which contained employment history, disciplinary notes, and wage totals. Camps kept archives so complete that, decades later, historians could trace a single man's movement from a North African battlefield to a Kansas wheat farm. Every paycheck from a farmer was logged, every purchase in a canteen recorded. In a war defined by destruction and chaos, this bureaucracy of control and fairness stood out as a reflection of the country's ethos. The program's success depended on trust. Though fences and guards remained, the relationship between prisoners, farmers, and administrators evolved into one of cautious cooperation. Reports from the War Department noted that morale among prisoners assigned to steady work was significantly higher than among those kept idle. Productivity increased, incidents of unrest declined, and the camps became almost self-regulating communities. By late 1944, the sight of POW trucks had become a familiar part of the American landscape. To passers-by, the convoys symbolized both war and order, a reminder that even the chaos of global conflict could be organized through rules, ledgers, and human discipline. Inside the trucks sat men who had once fought against the United States, now laboring under its protection, their days measured not by gunfire but by the rhythm of work, pay, and return. It was an unlikely harmony, born of necessity, sustained by law, and executed with a precision that turned captivity into something almost resembling ordinary life. Across the American heartland, the presence of German prisoners of war soon became an accepted, even indispensable, part of rural life. What had begun as an emergency measure evolved into a quiet partnership between former enemies bound by the common necessity of work. The reality of this cooperation unfolded in thousands of small encounters on farms, in canneries, and in lumberyards from Minnesota to Alabama, each reflecting both the practical success and the human complexity of the program. In Minnesota, where canning factories faced collapse due to the absence of migrant workers, the arrival of German prisoners saved an entire season's harvest. At peat processing plants in Le Sueur and Montgomery, hundreds of men labored from dawn until dusk, sorting and loading vegetables with military precision. Reports from the Minnesota Historical Society document how the 1944 pea and sweet corn harvests reached near-record levels despite wartime shortages, thanks largely to prisoner labor. Local newspapers, once cautious in tone, began publishing editorials praising the discipline and efficiency of the German crews. Farmers described them as reliable, orderly, and precise, qualities that contrasted sharply with the propaganda image of ruthless Nazi soldiers. In Iowa, the experience was similar. At Camp Algona, the largest POW base in the Midwest, more than 10,000 prisoners were dispatched daily to surrounding counties to pick corn, stack hay, and repair silos. The local press noted that they worked faster and more carefully than many civilian crews. The Algona Upper Des Moines newspaper observed in a 1945 issue that not one ear of corn was lost to weather, a quiet tribute to the men who had harvested fields that would otherwise have gone barren. Some farmers, at first uneasy about hosting the enemy, found themselves impressed by the politeness and discipline of the workers. When harvest ended, a few even sent letters of thanks to the camp commander, expressing gratitude for what one called the best workers we ever had. Further south, in Alabama and Mississippi, German prisoners filled a labor void left by thousands of sharecroppers who had migrated to defense factories. They worked long hours under the intense southern sun, picking cotton and peanuts or tending to cattle. For many of them, it was the first time they had seen the remnants of the American segregation system. While they were kept separate from black laborers, they occasionally observed the inequalities of the Jim Crow South with bewilderment. Letters later intercepted by censors revealed that some prisoners compared their own treatment favorably to that of local African American workers, a contrast that left a deep impression on them and later appeared in their post-war testimonies. In Kansas and Nebraska, where vast fields stretched to the horizon, the presence of prisoner work crews made the difference between scarcity and abundance. Farmers coordinated with local county agents to schedule groups of 20 to 30 men who would arrive by truck each morning. They operated threshing machines, repaired irrigation ditches, and loaded grain into rail cars bound for coastal ports. During the 1944 harvest, Kansas reported one of its largest wheat yields of the war, a statistic historians now attribute partly to the steady labor provided by German POWs. The everyday interactions between prisoners and civilians gradually reshaped public perception. At first, communities were wary. Rumors circulated about escapes or acts of sabotage, though in reality such incidents were extremely rare. Most prisoners understood that the United States was their safest refuge from the dangers of the collapsing Reich. As months passed, suspicion gave way to familiarity. Farmers who had once refused to speak to the prisoners began offering them coffee or water after long days in the heat. Some communicated through gestures and smiles. Others learned bits of German, enough to exchange a greeting or a joke. Several accounts from the period capture these quiet moments of humanity. In rural Minnesota, a farmer's wife was reported to have baked bread for the entire German work crew after one of them repaired her broken fence post without being asked. In another instance, a group of prisoners on a Kansas farm crafted handmade toys out of scrap wood and gave them to local children before Christmas. Such gestures were small, but they carried symbolic weight in a time when war seemed to divide the world completely. The military authorities tolerated this limited contact, understanding that goodwill fostered cooperation and reduced tension. Camp reports noted a consistent decline in disciplinary problems among prisoners who worked regularly outside the wire. The act of labor, coupled with humane treatment, seemed to erode ideological hostility. Many German soldiers, especially those captured after years on the front, experienced the rhythm of farm life as a form of rehabilitation. They wrote in censored letters home that they were learning how to live again, surrounded by people who did not hate them personally but simply expected them to do an honest day's work. By 1945, the experiment had proven its worth. The prisoners' contribution to American agriculture was immense, measured in millions of bushels harvested, in thousands of farms sustained, and in countless personal encounters that blurred the boundaries between enemy and neighbor. In towns like Algona, Minnesota, and Opelika, Alabama, those memories lingered long after the war ended. What began as a pragmatic response to a labor shortage became, for many Americans and Germans alike, an unexpected lesson in shared humanity. The impact of the prisoner of war labor system extended far beyond the fences of the camps, or the boundaries of wartime necessity. Economically, it played a critical role in maintaining the stability of the American home front during the final years of World War II. Socially and morally, it became one of the most revealing experiments in the humane treatment of enemies ever conducted during modern warfare. The program demonstrated that even under conditions of total war, a nation could remain faithful to its own laws and principles while meeting its material needs. By the end of 1945, German prisoners in the United States had contributed tens of millions of man-hours of labor. Official records from the Office of the Provost Marshal General show that more than 425,000 prisoners had participated in some form of productive employment, with the majority assigned to agriculture. Historians estimate that these men harvested hundreds of thousands of tons of crops, wheat, corn, cotton, vegetables, and fruit, that would otherwise have spoiled. In states like Kansas, Iowa, Texas, and Alabama, their work was directly credited with preventing food shortages that might have crippled both domestic markets and military supply lines. Wartime production statistics confirm that, despite the loss of millions of American workers to the armed forces, agricultural output actually increased during 1944 and 1945. The system also had a stabilizing effect on rural communities. Farmers who had feared economic ruin were able to meet government quotas and sustain their livelihoods. The influx of reliable labor allowed the War Food Administration to continue shipping vast quantities of food to Allied troops overseas, including Britain, Italy, and later France. For many Americans, the success of the prisoner work program became a point of quiet national pride, a symbol of organization and moral consistency amid global upheaval. Yet the more lasting consequences were psychological and cultural rather than economic. For the German prisoners themselves, captivity in the United States proved transformative. They had entered the camps expecting brutality, and emerged with an entirely different understanding of their enemy. The system of fair treatment, regular wages, and structured work routines contradicted years of Nazi propaganda that had depicted Americans as ruthless and decadent. Many wrote home describing their astonishment at being treated with respect, fed adequately, and even paid for their labor. The effect of this experience lingered long after their repatriation. When the war ended in 1945, repatriation took months to complete. Most prisoners were transferred to Britain or France before being allowed to return to Germany between 1946 and 1947. As they reintegrated into a devastated homeland, they carried with them memories of an orderly and humane America. For many, those memories shaped their post-war views of democracy, freedom, and justice. Oral histories collected decades later reveal that countless former prisoners saw their time in the United States as a moral education, an encounter with a society that practiced the fairness it preached. Some even referred to it as their second schooling. A number of former prisoners returned to the United States after the war, this time voluntarily. Drawn by opportunity and by a sense of gratitude, they immigrated under new visa programs in the 1950s and 1960s. They became mechanics, teachers, engineers, and farmers, often settling in the same regions where they had once labored as captives. In towns across the Midwest, quiet friendships persisted between local families and the men who had once worked their land. Letters were exchanged for years, and reunions occasionally took place when tourists from Germany sought out the farms of their wartime memories. The American public, too, was changed by the experience. The presence of thousands of former enemy soldiers within their borders had initially provoked fear and hostility, but over time it fostered a more nuanced understanding of the human face of war. Communities that had interacted with the prisoners discovered that their supposed enemies were not monsters, but ordinary men caught in the machinery of a collapsing regime. This realization contributed subtly to the post-war atmosphere of reconciliation that would define early U.S. West German relations. From an institutional perspective, the program became a model for future prisoner management policies. The success of the U.S. approach, rooted in adherence to international law, administrative oversight, and the recognition of labor as a means of rehabilitation, stood in sharp contrast to the atrocities committed in Axis-run camps. In the following decades, military scholars and humanitarian organizations cited the American system as evidence that compliance with the Geneva Convention was not only morally sound but operationally effective. In retrospect, the legacy of the POW labor program was both practical and profound. It ensured that America's farms continued to feed the world during the most destructive war in history, and it left a moral imprint on thousands of men who had once fought against it. In the quiet rhythm of work and pay, of respect and discipline, something unexpected had taken root, a belief that justice and humanity could coexist even in the midst of total conflict. For the German prisoners, it became a living proof that dignity could survive defeat. For the Americans, it confirmed that strength did not have to mean cruelty. The echoes of that understanding endured long after the last prisoners boarded ships for home. Decades after the war ended, the legacy of the German prisoner of war labor program in the United States remained visible not only in the historical record but in the landscapes themselves. Across the Midwest and the South, the remnants of camps, the faded outlines of barracks, and the quiet testimonies of farmers all pointed to an episode of war that had unfolded not with violence, but with cooperation. What had once been temporary installations of captivity evolved into places of memory and reflection, where Americans and Germans alike revisited one of the most paradoxical chapters of the conflict, the moment when enemies worked side by side in peace. In Iowa, the site of Camp Algona became one of the most well-documented examples of this legacy. During the war, it had been the administrative center for dozens of branch camps scattered throughout the Midwest, housing over 10,000 German prisoners. In the years that followed, former guards, local residents, and even ex-prisoners collaborated to preserve its history. In 2003, the Algona POW Museum opened on the original site, displaying artifacts, letters, photographs, and the famous life-size nativity scene that the prisoners carved in 1944 from cement and wire. That sculpture, now restored and displayed every Christmas, stood as a quiet symbol of faith and reconciliation, a reminder that even in captivity, men sought to create beauty rather than destruction. Further south, in Georgia, the grounds of Camp Gordon and Camp Wheeler were partially preserved and commemorated through local historical societies. Former farmland where prisoners once picked peanuts and cotton now carried plaques and interpretive signs describing how enemy soldiers had helped sustain American agriculture. In Texas, where more than 70 camps once dotted the countryside, small museums and memorials emerged near Hearne, Mejia, and Hereford. The Hereford POW Camp Museum in particular chronicled the daily life of the thousands of German and Italian captives who lived there, showing diaries, handmade tools, and the scrip they used for purchases. These museums, often run by volunteers, became places where communities reflected on how humanity had persisted amid the machinery of war. The archival record reinforced this transformation of memory. The U.S. National Archives and numerous state historical societies preserved thousands of photographs showing German prisoners smiling beside American farmers, their hands dusty from harvest work. In one such image from 1945, taken near Owatonna, Minnesota, two young prisoners in khaki uniforms stand beside a farmer's truck, lifting boxes of vegetables. The men grin at the camera, their posture relaxed, their uniforms clean. It is a photograph that defies the standard imagery of war. No guns, no anger, only labor and fatigue shared under the same sun. Similar photos from Kansas, Nebraska, and Alabama repeat this unlikely motif: work replacing conflict, order replacing hatred. For many local residents, the memory of the camps carried no bitterness. Oral histories collected in the 1980s and 1990s revealed that farmers still remembered the prisoners fondly, often referring to them simply as the boys. In several cases, former prisoners returned decades later as tourists or immigrants, visiting the very farms where they had once labored. Stories abound of reunions in which elderly Germans met the American families who had given them coffee or a place at the dinner table during the war. These encounters were small acts of reconciliation, but they carried deep emotional weight. They illustrated how personal memory, unburdened by ideology, could outlast the divisions of history. In Germany, too, the legacy endured. Many former prisoners who had experienced fair treatment in the United States became advocates for a post-war German-American friendship. Their testimonies appeared in post-war books and interviews, shaping the way ordinary Germans understood their former enemies. In some cases, returning veterans told their families that their years in American captivity had given them their first direct understanding of democracy in practice, a lesson that influenced West Germany's emerging political culture. For historians, the program became a case study in the moral dimensions of war. It demonstrated that adherence to law and human rights could coexist with efficiency and security. The American approach to prisoner labor, though born of necessity, had produced a model of humane pragmatism that influenced later international standards for the treatment of prisoners of war. The meticulous records kept by the Office of the Provost Marshal General became essential documents for the study of how bureaucracy could serve morality rather than undermine it. Today, the landscapes where those camps once stood often appear ordinary: flat fields, county fairgrounds, or wooded hills. Yet beneath them lies a story of unlikely coexistence. The surviving artifacts, photographs, and museums serve not as monuments to victory, but as reminders of restraint and decency. In a war that witnessed so much cruelty, the American POW program offered a glimpse of what civilization could look like even in its darkest hour. The legacy of those fields and camps remains, not in the machinery of war, but in the quiet proof that dignity, once extended, leaves a mark that no generation can fully erase. The story of the German prisoners of war who worked in the fields and factories of America was, at its core, a story about the limits and resilience of human decency. It revealed that even in a time defined by destruction, law and compassion could coexist with strength. The United States, facing the same chaos and fear that had consumed much of the world, chose not to mirror the brutality of its enemies but to uphold its own moral and legal standards. This decision, expressed not in grand speeches but in the quiet administration of wages, rules, and fairness, became one of the most profound ethical statements of the war. For the men behind the barbed wire, this experience challenged everything they had believed. They had been told that the enemy was cruel, that capture meant humiliation and misery. Instead, they entered a system governed by order and consistency, where their labor was recorded, their food rationed fairly, and their dignity recognized through the simple act of being paid. It was bureaucracy turned into morality, a structure so ordinary that it became revolutionary in its implications. The Geneva Convention, often dismissed as mere diplomacy, took on real meaning in those camps and fields. It proved that law could be a shield even for the defeated, that civilization could persist amid the madness of war. This adherence to principle was not born from sentimentality. It came from a belief deeply rooted in the American idea that justice, once abandoned, cannot be easily recovered. The War Department's insistence on humane treatment was as much a strategic decision as an ethical one, a way of demonstrating to the world that democracy could remain coherent under the greatest strain. But in doing so, the United States also gave the prisoners something more enduring, a glimpse of a society governed not by fear, but by structure and accountability. For many Germans, this became their first lived experience of fairness unconnected to power. On the surface, it was a simple exchange, labor for wages, hours for order, but beneath it lay a quiet moral revolution. Every signed time sheet and every credited payment represented an inversion of the logic of total war. Where other regimes had reduced captives to tools, America transformed captivity into participation. The prisoners, though confined, became contributors to the very economy that sustained the struggle against their homeland. This paradox did not humiliate them, it humanized them. Work, stripped of coercion and cruelty, became a form of reconciliation. The consequences of this moral choice echoed far beyond the farms of Iowa or the canneries of Minnesota. When the war ended and the prisoners returned to a ruined Germany, many carried with them not bitterness but an enduring respect for the justice of their captors. They had witnessed a form of strength that did not depend on domination. Decades later, historians and former prisoners alike would point to this experience as one of the foundations of post-war reconciliation between the United States and the new democratic Germany. The seeds of that future understanding were sown not in treaties or summits, but in the patient routine of shared labor. In the philosophical sense, the POW program stood as proof that the character of a nation is revealed most clearly in how it treats those who cannot defend themselves. America's choice to apply its own standards of law and fairness to its enemies was not an act of perfection, it was an act of preservation. It preserved the idea that war need not erase humanity, that even in the most extreme circumstances, moral order can prevail over vengeance. The fields of Kansas, the canneries of Minnesota, and the cotton rows of Alabama were not only scenes of wartime necessity, they were the testing grounds of a civilization's conscience. In those quiet rural landscapes, the conflict between hatred and justice played out in miniature, and justice prevailed. The men who once marched under opposing flags found themselves bound by the same rhythm of work and rest, the same expectation of fairness, the same recognition of shared labor. It was a reminder that dignity could be restored not through grand gestures but through consistency, respect, and restraint. In the end, the legacy of the German prisoners of war in America was not about victory or defeat, but about continuity, the continuity of values that endured even when the world seemed intent on destroying them. In their story, humanity proved that it could survive captivity, and that freedom, before it is a political state, is first a moral condition.